Hello, everybody. I'm ZKast from ZK Research, and I'm back for another ZKast video. This is part of my thought leadership series. And as always, these are done in conjunction with my media partner, eWEEK. And so thanks, eWEEK, for that. And I'm joined today by the CEO of Masergy. And I didn't realize this, Chris, but I'm actually wearing Masergy blue, it appears, by the look of your background. So anyways, I have Chris MacFarland, CEO of Masergy. Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and Masergy as a company?
Yeah, no, happy to. First of all, just thanks for having me on the show this week. Been looking forward to it. You're definitely in the Masergy blue colors. Listen, I'm happy to talk about myself, but I'll probably just pivot quickly to the company. I'm a long-term, not as much gray as more gray than I'd like, but not as much gray as I probably should have. Being in the industry about 30 years, 100% on the service provider, data networking, internet, and now kind of the cloud networking business. So Masergy's, not a young company, but not an old company. They were in our 21st year. Really, really focus on serving businesses and helping them with their journey to the cloud. And we do that across what we call cloud networking, which we'll talk a little bit about SD-WAN and SaaS and kind of the current generation of technology there. And then being security first minded, and then cloud communications. And it's a pretty exciting time for the business itself, because we're kind of in this next wave of networking and helping people through their kind of digital transformation projects. And, as you know, it's been a more than bit of a weird year. I think we're just literally past kind of the 1 year anniversary of COVID. But listen, we've been focused on how do we help companies through not only this near term set of challenges that they have, but more importantly, how do we help them as they try to achieve, kind of their broader journey to their own transformation projects.
I first got introduced with Masergy. It's funny how the world goes full circle sometimes, right? I first got introduced to Masergy when I was first at Yankee Group, which was 2001. I think you guys had just come out of stealth mode. Yeah. And the big problem you were trying to solve was like video everywhere. And I remember at the time Cisco used to talk about video being the new voice, and everybody expected video to explode. And it didn't really happen then. But now with the pandemic, video is everywhere. And it seems like the network, Masergy built to handle that kind of video traffic. And it almost seems like it was, purpose built for this era.
Absolutely. So if you go back to the early 2000s, right? The problems that we were trying to solve then were, how do we give multi-location and more specifically multinational corporations the data connectivity that they needed so that their offices could communicate with each other. And if you think about kind of that era, it was kind of MPLS-based mesh networking, and we pioneered, software-defined networking, and then innovated with analytics, and then kind of the journey continued on to where we're at today. But the world's changed so much since then, because back then, most corporations had their own data centers and housed all of their own applications. And then what we've seen occur and really start to accelerate in the last decade is this shift to using software as a service wherever they can. And then in many cases, using infrastructure as a service for they need compute, storage, and other things. And they still have a lot of their applications in their own, either co-located or their own data centers still, but it's a hybrid journey for pretty much everyone. And depending on which vertical market and which markets got disrupted earlier, depends on which kind of part of the life cycle that they're on. But video and voice are some of the most demanding applications. And, we were really proud back in the late 2000s, we handled more Cisco telepresence and Polycom real presence than anybody else in the world. And when you fast forward to where we're at today, we've kind of continued to build upon, when you need your apps to run perfectly all the time, we're absolutely the service provider you want to turn to.
Yeah, well, if you can handle Cisco telepresence, you can certainly handle WebEx and Salesforce and those types of apps. So good for you guys. Now that we're about a year into the pandemic, as you mentioned, and the vaccine's out, are your customers talking about a return to work? I get this question all the time, and it seems like there's a bunch of varying opinions. But in your opinion, what do you think this is going to look like?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that we're still debating even inside of our own company. we were one of the first companies, literally that second week of February, that went 100% virtual across the entire globe. And I think we're going to be one of the first companies to allow our knowledge workers to come back into our offices where there's been, a decent amount of the vaccine rolled out. And so we have been talking to our customers about this. And it's really interesting. It's really interesting because we had a customer advisory board meeting about 90 days ago. And the one thing that we learned there that we didn't have a lot of great visibility to was that in almost all of our customers' Asian countries, they'd already returned back to the office space.
Yeah, I've heard that.
There's a couple of countries where that's not the case. The Philippines was one that has not had that occur. And basically what they said is that, everybody was willing to mask up and fundamentally believe that if they were wearing masks, that there wasn't that big of a challenge. I think here in the United States, which is where we're headquartered here in North Texas, we've been voluntarily coming back into the office since, kind of last summer. And we've put in and instituted the same processes that I think most companies have done, which is you got to do a health check when you come in. You've got to, do it after you come back from lunch. And it's not an easy process. And you're definitely wearing a mask when you're not sitting at your cube or your desk. And we have seen what I think most other professional services or knowledge worker based businesses experience, which is we don't have that many people coming into the office. People have found it to be very beneficial to work from home. They're just more productive. They can flex in and out of time. And so the work from home policy that we see going forward is that people are going to probably be spending, 2 to 3 days a week in the office and, the other time at home working from home. And so I think we're all trying to figure out what are the right policies. How do you still have the right amount of collaboration? And that's one of the things that we're excited about is we do help companies collaborate a little bit better, over things like, Cisco WebEx and Zoom and Microsoft Teams. But what's the right amount of serendipity that you still need in the office place? And so our management teams are working through it. I think most enterprises have been, we've seen people like Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan be, really leaning in one direction, which he wants everybody back in the office. And then you've seen other companies say that they're going to remain 100% virtual, which I think is the other, stance that you could take place. We think, just like many things, the answer is probably somewhere in the middle for most companies, which is where I know we're landing and where, from the feedback we have from our customers, is where they're largely landing with their knowledge workers. Those that manufacture things or have other needs, they're already kind of quasi back in their either, factories or warehouses or other premises.
Yeah, I think there's certain, I was debating with somebody the other day. There's certain industries like education. I cannot for the life of me see education staying virtual, even though you can make the argument that, if we got better at it, it could work. I just think, it plays a dual role. It's childcare, but it's also, teaching kids. And I think kids need that social interaction. There's other ones, obviously, like retail, where you got to be there. But I think you're right. It is going to be somewhere in the middle. And, if we are going to work in this hybrid model, if you will, that really, I think, has kind of an interesting impact on remote workers. So initially, and I've seen some of the data you guys produce on SSL VPN connections or whatever, most companies took a very tactical approach to connecting remote workers. We just, beefed up our VPN license and got them connected any way we could because we thought, remember, we were told 2 weeks we'd be back in the office, right?
Yes.
Then 2 weeks became 2 months, became a year. But now that it's becoming permanent for a lot of companies, as you mentioned, how are customers rethinking remote access? Because I get the sense that it's still, kind of a problem for a lot of companies.
Yeah, so I think the forward-leaning companies are still are and you're 100% right? We saw VPN usage grow by 500% in less than 2 weeks, and it stayed there, subsequent to that. And I think people are each company's figuring out what is their work from home policy. And then when you think about it from the technologies, the dynamics, right? It's kind of funny when you think about it from a network technology standpoint. You've had kind of this perimeter defense system that we were all talking about for the last handful of years. Like, that's not enough, right? Your attack surfaces is so much greater with just your employees and other ways that they can enter into your infrastructure. And then with the advent of the cloud and moving to SaaS, now all of a sudden we have people that are accessing a big chunk of their corporate resources from their homes versus doing it every once in a while, doing it all day, every day. So it's changed kind of what happens with people's infrastructure at their house, which was already moving at with a frenetic pace with the advent of all the streaming technology the last 5 to 6 years. And so we immediately said, not only can we help you with your VPN services, but there's also kind of this different way that can be SASE enabled for work from home, and also give you the security perimeter that your enterprise still needs, plus make it a more reliable communication technology. Because what you want, just like you and I, is that if you're a professional knowledge worker, you want your environment at home to be almost as good as what you have in the office, if not as good as what you have in the office. That way, no matter where you're at, you're able to be extremely productive. And then those of us that are road warriors, and I know you're a bit of a road warrior too, when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, you want to have at least 80% of the capabilities when you're working from a hotel or from a client's office or from a remote office, somewhere else. And so we think this technology, when you combine it with things like Zoom and, WebEx and Teams, should allow us to kind of work from anywhere, which I think is a really good thing, because then it allows, all the things that we want as individuals, which is flex time with family, friends, hobbies, things that are other interests, so that we can be, I hate to use the word hyper productive, but we can be just as productive as sitting in a 9 to 5, chair every week.
Yeah, there's arguments to be made that you're more productive, but I'm not sure I totally believe that. Although you're not commuting now, so there is that. Now, it's an interesting shift that's happened here, because we were in this phase where SD-WAN was red hot, and then the pandemic started, right? So companies were in the middle of this WAN transformation. Then we ditched that. We went to all remote workers, and you could argue that your WAN became every employee. So how do those two, you just talked about the remote access strategy. How does that fit into a company's broader WAN strategy? So these two parallel things we had going on, we can now merge together.
Yeah, no, it's I think the journey absolutely continues on to this next generation of technology. And you're right, we were, I would say, a little bit past the early adopter phase with what was quote unquote SD-WAN. And the first couple innings of that were kind of driven more by the unmanaged, do-it-yourself kind of equipment manufacturer driven, technology. And we just started seeing the pivot towards more managed services, which is something that, of course, we've got a lot of bias towards. But I think what we really figured out is, as we continue to see this unfold, that we're talking about a significant edge refresh that's taken place. And so the discussion's been around what services should reside in quote unquote the cloud or the edge of the network, and what should be in the customer edge. And now that you have endpoints or users that are largely at home, how do we give them the right edge networking capabilities? And how do you glue all of this together, in a software defined world? I think for us, it was just building upon, the current kind of building blocks that we'd already, spent time, money, and invested from a technology standpoint, which is some of your services, if not a lot of your networking services and security services, can come from the cloud. And there'll be some technology that'll be in an appliance that's sitting at the customer edge or the home user edge. But you shouldn't care where those things are coming from, as long as you know that you're secure, your connection's highly reliable, and that you've got access to the resources on demand when you need them, whether it's your corporate resources or the other resources that you want to get to across the public internet. So I think that's the real pivot that we're kind of seeing. Gartner put together a framework, for what they call SASE, or the Secure Access Service Edge. Most of that framework was what we already had built, and we were just continuing to extend it as part of our innovation. But we see companies looking at this and saying, yeah, this actually makes a tremendous amount of sense. And I think it's really helpful, because just like, compute storage got cloudified back in the late 2000s and the early 2010s, the network's going through that same process right now. And the end result is that it's going to be more cost effective for businesses, but more importantly, they're going to be more secure. They're going to have better performance and better reliability, so that the end user experience and the things that allow work from home to work will work dramatically better. And so I think it's it's kind of an exciting decade for us. When I look from where we're at today, which granted is on the back end of a really painful process with the pandemic, no matter who you are, to what we're looking at from a tech standpoint and what it means to a lot of different industries over the next decade.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the sort of manage aspect of what you do, because I do see, before I was an analyst, I actually ran networks, and the WAN was, a challenge, and now we add in remote workers and software defined, and certainly the complexity level you can see has gone up, and a lot of those early adopters were willing to deal with that, but certainly as you go mainstream, then in fact, all my survey data shows we're going to see a pretty big spike in managed services, so that should be a good opportunity for you. Now, one of the things you mentioned was SASE, which has become, it seems like, the industry's latest buzzword in networking. One of the things I've noticed about SASE is, depending on which vendor you are, you define it a little bit differently. So what does SASE mean to Masergy?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it does mean different things to different, I would call it, service providers. And there's a deep scramble, because it is, without a doubt, one of the most hyped up buzzwords, but it is real. And, it stands for secure access services. So how do you connect into, the cloud per se, and then how do you get a secure environment to all of those resources? There are companies that other said, listen, we want to build the entire stack and every piece of technology. So it's a combination of, the edge connection, a secure web gateway, i.e. the ability to do internet bypass or internet offload versus things that are going back towards corporate resources, broker of access services to various cloud vendors that are sitting out there. We made a decision that orchestration, analytics, the ability to have human capital that can look at challenges as we see the algorithms or something else take place, was intellectual property that we wanted to own, and we've invested over a decade into these areas. And then on the flip side, we wanted to partner with best of breed companies. So today, for most SD-WAN appliances or SASE connections, we're using Fortinet as our partner. They've got a almost 20-year history and at scale, in the cybersecurity framework. Now, it's not all of our cybersecurity services, but for cloud firewall and secure web gateway, that just makes a whole lot of sense. When we think about access brokers to the rest of your cloud infrastructure, which is kind of the reverse of zero trust, we partnered with a company called BitGlass, because we knew we could deliver a managed service there that was, truly best of breed. And then when we looked at endpoint detection and how that could be coupled back with our managed detection response or threat management response, which are services that we've designed over the years, we partnered with a company called SentinelOne, and in some cases we use also Fortinet's technology. So we think the combination of having our own technology and analytics and automation combined with best of breed technology vendors is the right framework for SASE. And when we think about the adoption curve, which will really pick up in kind of 2022 to 2023, that will be there at the right place in the right time as businesses want to lean further and further into these types of services. And I don't know what, I'd be curious to hear your viewpoint, because I know you're an expert in this space. What are you seeing?
Well, first of all, as far as technology partners go, you picked all Magic Quadrant leaders there, so that makes some sense. And then Fortinet, I've written a lot of the security space, and I think they are the vendor that offers the best price performance because they spin their own silicon. But as far as SASE definition goes, it's pretty much in alignment, I think, the way you're thinking about it. I think the original definition that came out had everything being cloud delivered, and as you mentioned, that Masergy has stuff in the cloud, but also stuff on premise. And I think when you think of remote workers, obviously want to deliver that stuff from the cloud. Right? I'm not handing you a FortiGate to put in your home. Well, you might have one, Chris, right. but most people probably don't. But if I've got an office with 10,000 people in it, then FortiGate makes sense there, because all the traffic going to and from the network would saturate the link, right, just for inspection purposes. So I do think that model of where it's cloud managed, but where the infrastructure is, really needs to be almost irrelevant to the customer, especially for the one that's managing it. So are there any other differentiators you think set yourself apart in the area of SASE?
Well, I think there's more than a few, right? the flexibility and the modularity to whether some of the services are on the customer edge or on the network edge. I think when we look forward, the analytics and the automation that we have are absolutely market leading. And the fact that we can look and tell you every SaaS application that you have running anywhere in your network. And then we can actually tell you based upon the propensity of how your machines and users are using the technology to tell you what are the things you can do to enhance performance if you wanted to. Or even if you've got areas where you've got congestion at certain times a day, we can say, hey, if you carve back these applications for those times a day, you'd have a better experience for, let's take Salesforce, for example, versus, Facebook. And so being able to deliver, automation that matters, which gets really into our AI ops areas, because when we look back at the last couple of years, it was more around finding things that were just kind of honestly kind of not, that were broken, that were like, hey, you should just fix this, to now, with the new release of AIOps 2.0, the ability to give you propensity modeling and tell you where you've got, all your SaaS applications, then I'm telling you how do you make your performance better, is kind of this ongoing longer term roadmap that we have and vision towards what we call autonomous networking. And I'm super excited about the current phase that we're in, because I think we're going to have a huge leap in analytics versus any of our competitors per se. And then secondarily, being able to take, those analytics and make really, really deep insights so that our customers don't have to have as many network engineers or network administrators or application engineers or just infrastructure engineers in general, is huge value add, especially when you think about the fact that, when you think about a managed or co-managed service, it's all about allowing our customers to be more strategic back to their business, which means that we're taking things that are really complex and making them simple. And so being able to use a single pane of glass portal or now just having a simple SMS saying, hey, we're seeing this, do you want to take action against it? It gets us to a point in time to where we're just trying to make the world easier for everyone.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up AI and automation and AI ops. I know that's an area Masergy's been leading in. I think you were the first service provider of any kind to actually come out with an AI ops offering. And now, as a former network engineer, if somebody had mentioned automation to me when I was an engineer, I'm not sure how well it would have been embraced, but I do understand the need for it now. But can you give me some good use cases where you would apply AI ops?
Some of the best use cases right now is and we've been doing this with just a customer last week. We were chatting with them about it. Is we can plug in our devices into their network, look at their flows, and then the flows will find their top 25 applications, whether they're applications that are in their data centers or SaaS applications sitting out in the cloud, and then can virtually tell them from every location what are the best paths they should be taking and how much bandwidth do they need. And what's interesting is we've found in almost every scenario, there's a bunch of apps running around that they weren't aware of. I think we call that shadow IT in the industry. So then they can make some decisions on whether they just want to cut it off completely or just carve down the bandwidth that's sitting out there for that. And then secondarily, almost everybody's got a journey where they're moving, servers between data centers or between co-location centers, or they're shutting down things and consolidating, or they've got new, they're spinning up a lot more, instances inside of Azure or AWS. And then just for them to see the traffic, and then for us to tell them, in advance, not only are we seeing these changes, but here's how you can enhance the user experience is, use cases that we're really, really excited about. Now that sounds, a lot different than what most network engineers have to deal with, because most network engineers, when we look back at the last decade, would look at networks when they had severe challenges. Like you had some executive complaining about user experience, you had a customer complaining about user, or supply chain partner you complain about, and that's when they would dive into the analytics. We're saying now we can be predictive in behavior, and we can watch this and make good predictions for you. And if you think about it, being proactive versus reactive is a challenge that I think every, either entrepreneur or executive or business leader or manager, deals with. And this is allowing the infrastructure to come alive and to be much more proactive versus being a little bit behind, the eight ball in terms of what's taking place across their infrastructure. And if you think about the cloud journey, right, there's so many different SaaS applications and so many other things. We're actually watching, 4,000 different types of applications on behalf of our customers. And then more importantly, telling them, here are the things that we'd recommend for you in terms of bandwidth or changes to how bandwidth gets allocated, or how you change the quality of experience, or even the path that certain applications take. Like where should you have direct connections to, Salesforce or Oracle or to AWS or to Microsoft? We can now tell you that and then tell you how much bandwidth you need. So I think we're coming at a point in time to where we can make things hyper efficient. And then the underlying transport network, whether they need broadband, DIA, or private connectivity to those offices, there's something that I think is the holy grail of networking. And we're right around that precipice of it. And it's really driven by the fact that we've really, really invested in these algorithms to try to make, network engineers and administrators and heads of infrastructure, their lives is dramatically easier, than what they've been the last 30 years of IT.
Yeah, it's funny you brought up shadow IT, and right before the pandemic started, actually, one of your people who work for you, Ray Watson, and I would do a quick little video talking about shadow IT, and I had called it the single biggest problem that IT has, and it's like since the pandemic started, shadow IT is now on steroids, right? Where it's like in an effort to be more productive, companies just started deploying cloud-based apps, and IT has no control of that. And I'm glad you automate a lot of that stuff, because whenever I ask IT managers, like, how many cloud apps do you think you're running? They'll take a guess at a number, and it's always 10x more than that. So that's it's really the silent killer in a lot of cases. And so to me, that seems like a perfect use case for AIOps. So I'm going to transition to one last question, and I'm asking you to put a little bit of a vision hat on here. So, there's a lot of talk about intent-based networking and autonomous networks. Well, autonomous everything, right? The autonomous cars, whatever. But as far as autonomous networks go, where are we on the path to autonomous networks? And when do you expect that we'll actually have networks that run and secure themselves?
Yeah, that's one is not only an excellent question, but you definitely have to pull out a crystal ball and say, okay, where are we at on this continuum? And when you think about autonomous anything, there's a few key things that have to take place. One, you've got to have something that's able to observe, per se, everything that's running across the network. And I would call that, this first epoch of analytics, that sits out there. That's where I think companies are starting to invest a whole lot more. I think with the advent of SD-WAN technologies across the board, we saw, a lot of people step up their game versus where we were at historically, which we were almost standing alone in terms of analytics. And then the second thing is, then what do you do with the data that's taking place? What are the algorithms that you put out there that are, supervised learning? And then how do you get to unsupervised learning? And then how do you get to the network, self-correcting and self-optimizing? I think we've got, 1 to 2 more generations to go before anyone like us could declare victory around autonomous networking. And I'll tell you the current phase that we're absolutely in, which is allowing our customers to use something as simple as a response to a text message or an SMS message to say, hey, no, make this change. We see this activity going on. You want to change behavior. It's to be able to take this user interface and then allow, infrastructure leaders then do they trust the AIOps platform to make good decisions? And I think it's kind of similar to what we're seeing with those people that have, cars that have, what used to be called cruise control now is called, autopilot, where there's a lot of decisions you'll let your car make for you, but you're not going to let it make all decisions. I think us in the networking world are probably about a year behind. We're kind of, let's say, where Tesla is, and that's being the furthest leaning in with a company like, like Masergy. So I think we got about 2 years of learning. So call it 2023 is when I'd predict we'll have full autonomous network. And in my view of autonomous network is when your network infrastructure, which is all software defined and SASE driven, would self-optimize, self-heal, and self-reprogram because you trust it. And you know that it's going to deliver the experience for your applications, users, and other machines that is the intent of the network. And so there's that midpoint called intent-based networking, which is where I think we'll get to in 2022, which is a really close framework. And then it'll come back down to, what do businesses trust, what they don't trust, right? And that's the part I think even with autonomous vehicles that we don't know. When will we trust to hop in the car and just put in the destination address and sit back and watch the machine take us somewhere?
Yeah, that's a big leap of faith there. Elon Musk would tell you that's right around the corner. Although if you're the Tesla or the networking industry, then I guess that makes you the Elon Musk of networking. So I don't know.
Well, I appreciate the I appreciate the analogy. I can assure you I don't put in nearly as many hours as he does into his, I think last count dozen businesses that he's the CEO of.
Yeah. But no, thanks. I do think that you guys, Masergy was a real pioneer in the SD-WAN space. It's in fact, I think,
and we're going to continue to pioneer. That's not going to stop. So
yeah, in fact, I think you had SD-WAN before we even knew what SD-WAN was. So the way you built your network. So, anyways, Chris MacFarland, CEO of Masergy, thank you very much for joining me. This was really
thanks for having me on today.
And as always, these are done in conjunction with my media partner, eWEEK. And everybody watching this, thank you for watching. Click to subscribe, and I'll see you next week on ZKast.